There's no agenda. So what we will do is simply, I'll give you a chance to ask questions and the things I don't know, I will either say it's a mystery, or I will ask somebody in the room who might know the answer to comment on that also. So all I ask is, like anything, we always follow the gospel, and that means that we listen and speak respectfully to one another, and be nice. And my job as facilitator is to help us to remember that. So maybe hopefully I don't have to remind you, but I'll do that if we need to, okay? So who wants to start? The question is, when you die, we go to heaven, what happens? I mean, other than the mystery that we go to heaven, what happens? And I guess this is a good example, and I thought about this before, and I can get a lot of stories about this. There's a story not so long ago, someone asked the Pope if their pet would be with them in heaven. I have guys I play golf with, they want to know if they can play golf in heaven. Or hell. depending on their game. I think this is a good example of what I was trying to say during the homily. We can't get our heads around what this wonder is that we call heaven. And we try to make sense of it. So we think of the biggest and most important, best parts of our life today, like the love we have for our spouse, the love we have for our family, and we say heaven has to certainly include that. But we tend to make heaven small. We don't get the wonder of this. The wonder of heaven is we were born out of the womb of God's heart, the love of God, and when we die, we return fully to that. And we become as one with God as Jesus was with the Father, completely united in a God that is best described as love. So the thing I sometimes say, we think about how we think about heaven sometimes. We stand there like a guy holding the candle that we want to have our light, but we realize we're standing on the surface of the sun. Okay? The light, my little candle doesn't really mean much, but this is the best I got to think about it. But what the promise is, that we will be completely united with God in the same way that Jesus was united with his Father. Not in substance, that we don't become God in substance, but as completely united as that. And all that is love will be a part of that. So what are we going to be doing? I doubt if we have a to-do list each day. I don't think there'll be days. It's bigger than that. It's eternity. There's no calendar in eternity. So I don't know if I answered your question again, but what I want to emphasize is this is a mystery that I think many of us, as I look around, I'm not the oldest person or the youngest person in the room, but I think many of us, I'm at that point in my life where I ask these questions. What's it going to be? What's it going to look like? It is truly a mystery, but it's a good mystery, okay? It is more than you can imagine it will be. To be completely united in love. One of the analogies I've used with people when I was talking with somebody who was dying and thinking about what's it mean to die and to go to heaven, I said, this is like standing at the ocean that is the love of God. The immense ocean of God's love. And all God asks is, come on in. Jump on in. The water's fine. The water's fine. That's the mystery, but that's the promise. And for me, that gives me a lot of, confidence isn't the right word. It gives me anticipation in some ways. I'm not going to rush the process, but that's to me sounds like a wonderful thing to be united with God. And I don't have to understand that. I just know it has to be wonderful. Doctrine and dogma can be considered pretty synonymous. But I think the question that you raise that is interesting is that there are different levels of authority with which the magisterium does their work. You know, dogma are things like Jesus is divine. The Eucharist is the real presence of Christ. Those are dogma, and the church would tell us those have to be accepted. That's what it means to be a Catholic, is that we believe in those things. There's not a lot, but there's a significant piece of that. But then there is this whole other thing, as the human institution cranks out advice to us, instructions to us, that is the teaching of the church. And again, that is, on the best case scenario, that is the result of about 2,000 years of struggling with the questions of God, the relationship of God across billions of people. And that all comes together in what we call the tradition, and that teaching goes forth. But the authority of a teaching does not have the same authority as a doctrine. That is also the teaching of the church. It isn't the same. So it can be, so things like the divinity of Christ, or the real presence in the Eucharist, are things that we are required as Catholics to accept and to try to believe. And there's a whole lot of teaching of the church that as a Catholic, we ought to be taken pretty dang serious, and we ought to be paying attention to it. We ought to allow that to help form our conscience. But there is, within the teaching of the church, room to faithfully dissent from that teaching. To say, wait a second, this isn't making sense to me. There's a way to do that faithfully. Now, most of the times we see people do that unfaithfully. We see people who do that mostly in anger. We see that people doing that mostly with a lot of self-interest in mind. But it is proper, it is okay for there to be dissent with teaching of the church. How do you think the church has changed? Okay. The church today is not the church that was in 1500. It's not the same church, the same set of doctrine, the same beliefs in 1200. How did that change? It's changed because people raised the question, and they developed the understanding, the communal understanding that the church has evolves. It changes. We get more informed. So I think it's important for us to know that there is a difference between doctrine and the teaching of the church, and to know which is which. But I think it's also important that we as Catholics, that we take it all pretty dang serious. You know, I'm not going to go to confession because no one's wearing a stole to give me absolution, but I struggle with some of the teachings of the church. Probably most of you do, in some one or another. If you read the statistics, if you read the surveys, most people disagree with parts of what the church teaches. Are you doing that in a faithful way? Are you doing it seriously? Not just, oh, I don't like the way that sounds to me. Have you thought it through, knowing what the church does teach, and then respond to it? That there is a tendency for us to, in the church, we like things clean and neat, you know, black and white. This is what the church teaches, you know. This is what Daddy tells you, and this is what Mother Church tells you. So just obey it and be quiet. Okay? There was we got along that way in the church for centuries, but we're making a shift where people need to be listened to. That's what the Synod on Synodality is about. People need to be listened to, and so that's what we're doing. I don't think the teaching of the church says you have to use this music or that music. It's really a local, I mean, there would be some music that would be clearly inappropriate. But in terms of styles of religious music, I don't think there's any normative doctrine or teaching of the church about that. It's for the local community, the local worship community, to choose how they do that. Now, I know that a lot of the controversy about that is who in the community is doing the choosing. Okay? I know that. Okay? But there is no definitive teaching that says, oh, no guitars. I mean, again, we look at all of these questions from our own narrow perspective. One of the great gifts that I had in terms of my own formation was that I lived outside of this country for about 9 years and traveled all over the world. Now, the question, should we do Gregorian chant or guitars, would be a nonsensical question in Tanzania. Okay? That just isn't, I mean, to think it's one or the other, and it has to be, it's, at some point it becomes nonsensical. The church is so much bigger than that. But the thing about how we worship, although it's so important, those are, in many ways, although we get guidance, like there's a guidance within a bishop's conference for this country, how we are to do worship, but it would not be specific to you can use guitars or not. I will do a very brief recruiting. Basically, the Companions program began back in 1990. At the time, we were saying we need to be, again, it was very much a response to Vatican II. It was saying that the church is bigger than a bunch of priests and brothers, and that laity was taking on a greater and greater role within the church. And we said, well, we think our spirituality helps us to do our ministry and to live our life faithfully. Maybe somebody else would think so too. And so we said, how do we share that spirituality and let that become a part of a layperson's faith life? And so we have ways of committing. It's called Companions. Eat bread with. Companions is take the etymology of that. But basically, it's a chance for people to learn about precious blood spirituality. I can tell you that it's been very interesting to see how that the involvement and participation of lay people, lay associates, how that has helped us and changed us as a province. It helped us to be broader, helped us to think differently. I remember the first times when Companions started coming to the assembly, our assembly, I was thinking, all these guys are acting better. It's like, they realize they should be embarrassed by the way they have been acting, and they're acting better. Okay, I think that's a good thing. So that Companions, again, and Jim, wave your hand. If you want to know more about Companions and how to join a Companions group, talk to him. And his wife. Yes. Yes, we have, again, these are rough numbers. When I was general, I knew I could give you these demographics. I can't give them to you very clearly now. We're having a lot of vocations in Tanzania. We're having some vocations enough vocations in India that it became a problem because we had more priests than we could find work for. We had a lot of vocations in Vietnam, and so we've actually shut down the formation program there, suspended it for a while, because we don't want the same problem we had in India, where the number of members outpaces our ability to grow the mission. So there are places where there's a lot of vocation. And what happens for our congregation is a mirror image of what you see in almost across the board. It's funny, we have about 90-some members in India, which is about 20% of the province, give or take, of the congregation. The Jesuits, I think, the last count I heard, had 19 provinces and about 4,000 members in India. I mean, people talk about our vocation thing problem here. I said, grab me a 727, and I'll go to Tanzania, and I'll come back with a full bus. Okay, that's possible, but there's a lot of things associated with that you have to consider. How do we do that? So it continues to be a concern here. We're continuing to try to recruit to find guys who discern a vocation with us here. But what happened in our congregation is pretty much the same as what has happened across the board to religious communities in this country. Pretty much. And Europe. You know, the talk, if you talk in the worldwide church, the truth, I've heard a theologian just say, I think it was last week, I was reading something that the center of the church today is Africa. It's not Europe. It's not the US. It's Africa, Asia. You know, the shift to the south. Okay? There's a lot of, that's a big shift in mentality because the people making the rules don't think like me anymore. Okay? Again, we try to make sense of things from our own perspective. We're too narrow. We're too human. You know, we need to be open to being stretched. Our hearts, but our minds also. But you know, the vocation developed over time. You know, 4 years at Brunnerdale, 4 years at St. Joe College, a year at a parish, 4 or 5 years in theology. And somewhere along that, for me, it was during the college years where there was more of a sense of discernment that, yeah, this is me. This is who I am. I'm these guys. And so it was has proceeded from there. You know, I was ordained. I was a happy little hospital chaplain and hospital administrator for about 8 years. Then it was like I wanted to put my focus on the community. For the last 35 years, my ministry has been the community. In one way or a different way or another. I helped start the Companions program, looking for a new way to do that. I helped start our fundraising branch of our Mission Advancement Office, not because I wanted us to go out and give money, but because I wanted us to go out and make friends. I wanted to give people a way to participate in our mission, what our work is, which is how we've always approached our quote-unquote fundraising. We decided in 2000 at a meeting of the assembly that we needed to do new things. And there were a group of us that said, well, we've been talking about reconciliation for the last 10 or 15 years, and everyone keeps asking, well, how do we do this? So 3 or 4 of us said, okay, we don't know how to do it either, but we'll try. And so we started the reconciliation ministry up in Chicago, not knowing a damn thing about what we were doing. No methodology to start with. It was just to go in and meet people, be present to people in a place of conflict. How does our spirituality call us to respond in a place of conflict where there's violence? How do we do that? So we did that ministry, and so I was worked with them for, you know, a good number of years. That ministry continues to flourish beyond our expectation as we involve more and more lay people who are involved in that work with us. I'll give a plug to my classmate Dave Kelly, who's a classmate with Dennis and Rick, who helped start that ministry. He's going to be here for one of these Sunday sessions. He'll tell you a lot about how you try to live precious blood spirituality in a place of conflict. Now, there he's dealing with physical human conflict, but all of us have situations where we deal with conflict, where we deal with disagreements. And our spirituality can give us some instruction or some guidance on how to do that. How do we respond to conflict other than to engage the conflict and try to win? How do we do that? So again, those are things. And like I said, for 12 years I was in general leadership in Rome, mostly in Rome. Again, general leadership means the way the congregation is structured. There's one worldwide umbrella called the congregation, and then in different geographical areas there are units. There's a province, or there's a vicariate, or there's a mission, different sizes and different degrees of autonomy. But we had about 7 provinces now, and various others. We've been consolidating those into a less number of provinces, less number of units, but more provinces, I should say. And so during that time, my job was to help really go around and help people do pastoral planning, help decide how to help them to define their mission in what's the mission of the Society of the Precious Blood in Colombia. Okay? Well, to have a process with people to help them to try to determine what that is. not to tell them what it is. I don't know anything about Colombia. I don't know anything about Brazil. But I can help them to ask the questions, and I help them to ask the questions about, in this location, this context, what's our charism call us to do? And so that's always been the question we've done. You know, I don't know if you know the history. We came to this country in 1841 or 2, whatever it was, at the invitation of the Bishop of Cincinnati to help build up the church, primarily in the Ohio Valley. That was, and so when we came here, the community here in this United States looked pretty different than what the congregation looked like in Italy, where we came from. Different context, different place, different mission in some ways, but the same spirituality. How do we take that spirituality and use it here? So that's what we've continued to do. So like I said, I did that for like 12 years. It was, being moderator general was part animator, trying to find nonviolent ways to give people a kick when they needed to try to move in a certain direction. And if some troubleshooting, you know, there's problems everywhere, okay? That continues. I'm glad it's not my problem anymore. But yeah, so I did that for like 12 years and came back, did a sabbatical, and then we started a spirituality institute. And then as a sign of how shallow the talent pool is, they made me treasurer. So that's what I'm doing now. So, I mean, it just changes over time. And, you know, when I look at that congregation, I mean, as I said, really for the last 35 years, you know, there's been no separation. For many guys in the community, there's always this tension between your community life and your ministry. And for most guys, the apostolate takes focus. You know, that really gets a lot of their insight. And we always talk about, oh, what about community? You know, it goes back and forth. But for me, the community was my apostolate. So I never had that kind of a tension in terms of between the two. And so I've been working for the congregation, trying to serve the congregation in some various capacity for, you know, a long time. I wouldn't have done that if I didn't love it. You know, I'm not packing any bags. I'm happy living in Chicago and being treasurer. Well, I'm not so happy about being treasurer, but I'm happy being in Chicago, and I'm doing my best in a job that needed to be done to serve the community. And so I do that. I hope to stay in Chicago until I move in here. I don't hope it to be real soon, and that's not about here. It's about the health I hope I have for a while. But I mean, again, it's for us in this country, the members of the congregation in this country, it's hard for us to see the demographic change. It's hard to see a drop in membership. It's hard for us to leave parishes that we served 100 years. I mean, that guys who lived and worked in Salina suffer when we leave Salina. Okay? That's part of us. That's how they did their job. So it's at a difficult time for us. And so really, I think for us to, we're trying to deal with that in a number of kinds of ways. But I think for me, when you say, well, how do I think about the congregation today? I think like all the other congregations, there's a shift going on. There's a shift going on. And the U.S. province isn't going to be the center of the congregation. That's what it is. Okay? So, and I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that. We live faith on a continuous journey. And every time you take another step, you look around, things are a little different. That's okay. There are some things that don't change. I mean, we're at a time in this country, obviously, where there's a lot of polarization, and we're not going to start yelling at each other about it. There's a lot of polarization in the church, which is much more of a heartbreak for me than the country, because it's so contrary to our theology of the body of Christ, people of God. I mean, it's so contrary. So what do we do? How do we do that? And again, I think it's on an individual basis that people have to ask their question. How do you deal with that situation? And I don't know what the answer is for individuals, but I know that there is a framework that has to be there as you decide what's the faithful way to respond. Because if your response is not loving, and if your response is not truthful, it's not faithful. So as you think about how do you deal with the situation in your parish, you deal with the situation in your family that's split up over ideological or political things, what's faithful, what's truthful. Because if you're not doing those two things, you're not doing gospel. Now, individually, what that means has to get worked out individually. But that's the framework that we have to stay in. I don't know if that made sense, but that's the parameters that the gospel gives us as we try to discern how we are to respond to others.
Faithful and truthful, or loving and truthful?
Loving and truthful is faithful. Yeah. It has to be, if it's not loving, if it's not truthful, it's not of God. And I think that the question itself, it's a very a familiar question in the sense that there are many people in the world today who are looking for ways to stay grounded in the present moment. Because it's only in the present that we can experience God. You know, we can remember God in the past, but we don't experience God in the past. We can think about God, that God will be there in the future, but God's not in the future yet because that doesn't exist yet. God is now. God is always present in the here and now. And so how do we allow ourselves to stay grounded in that present now, that present moment, when everything seems to work against it? I mean, we get bombarded with information. We get bombarded with stuff. So how do you do it? And I guess I can just tell you, not that I figured out how to do it, but I can tell you my own journey of trying to figure out how to do that comes down to doing centering prayer. I need to just have the discipline to sit quietly, to turn all of it off for at least 20 minutes and just listen to what's going on inside and put that aside. That when I do that, then some days, on a good day, part of the time, I'm able to do that. I'm able to then live that day a little more mindful that I have to be present to what's going on, to the person I'm standing next to, not somebody else, to what's being said to me now, to listen to them and to understand them and not to listen to them so I know how to refute what they're saying. You know, but for me, it's grounded in a practice of prayer that allows me to just quietly sit there and try to listen to God. That's my practice. Others might have other ways of doing that. Yeah, I have no way to solve the world's problems. I think one of the things, and they're very real, and we ought to be concerned about them. And yes, we pray about them at Mass every day. You know, there's a formula we're supposed to use for the prayers of the faithful, prayer for the church, prayer for civil authorities. Okay, we pray about this all the time. Okay, and that's good. But you know what? I'm not going to end the war in Ukraine. Nothing I'm going to do is going to do that. I'm not going to be able to solve all the controversy about immigration and asylum seekers. I don't have the master plan to do that. So for me, I think what it comes down to is I have to ask the questions about what I can control. Well, that's this. That's me. So what do I do? That's where I have some influence. That's where I can say how I can react. People talk about like I'll just use this as an example, the different camps within the church. The starting point for me is what's faithful is I have to be a non-combatant. I cannot engage that be a part of the problem. I have to not be conflictual. That's something I can control. Now, does that solve the problem of polarization within the church today? No. But it helps me to be faithful, and I think that's something I need to do. That's what I can control. That's what I ought to be concerned about. Maybe if enough of us do that, it has an effect.